The courtroom was alive with the sound of rustling papers and murmurs from the crowd as Judge Thomas Everly adjusted his glasses and looked down at the case file before him. His mind was focused and sharp, always precise in his judgments, but today something about the atmosphere felt different. Maybe it was the heat or the anticipation of the trial that had drawn so many eyes. But in that moment, the tension was undeniable. At the center of it all sat Maya Johnson, a young and accomplished attorney known for her intellect and her unwavering commitment to justice. She had already made a name for herself in the legal world. Her rise from humble beginnings was a testament to her hard work and determination. But even with her success, there were moments like these when the weight of the world seemed to press down on her. As she stood in front of the judge to address the court, her voice steady and confident, Maya didn't anticipate the outcome that would follow. It started with a question from the judge about a particular piece of evidence. Maya had presented. The tone in his voice was sharp and direct, as if he already had his mind made up. She answered with clarity, pointing out the significance of the evidence and how it related to the case at hand. Her response was precise, but when she finished, the judge's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. There was a subtle shift in the air, the type of moment when you could feel the judgment even before it was spoken. Judge Everly cleared his throat and addressed her with a firmness that seemed a little out of place, considering the simple nature of the question. He made a comment about decorum and the way she had presented her argument. His words were measured, but there was an underlying sharpness to them. Maya stood still, keeping her composure. Despite the sting of his words, she had encountered judges like him before, judges who held themselves above reproach and dismissed the efforts of young lawyers like her. She had faced worse in her career. But this moment felt different. There was something about the way he spoke to her that felt personal. The judge went on to announce that he was issuing a fine for her conduct in the courtroom, stating that her tone had been disrespectful and disruptive. Maya felt the room grow colder around her. She could feel the eyes of the others in the courtroom turn toward her in disbelief. Some of the more seasoned attorneys exchanged glances. They knew that this wasn't about procedure. It was about something deeper, something harder to define in that moment. Maya's heart raced and her pulse quickened, but she refused to show it. She had been the target of bias before and had learned long ago that the best way to face it was with strength and poise. As the gavel struck and the fine was imposed, Maya's mind flashed to all the times she had fought to be seen, to be heard. As a black woman in a profession that often overlooked her efforts, she had earned every success with sweat and tears. But it seemed that no matter how far she had come, moments like this were inevitable. But even as she stood there with the weight of the fine on her shoulders, Maya knew this would not define her. It would not break her. She would rise above it, as she had done countless times before. Her gaze never left the judge as she calmly nodded and accepted his decision, knowing that her journey was far from over. Maya walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, though her mind raced with a mix of emotions that she carefully kept in check. The fine was a bitter pill to swallow, but it wasn't new. She'd experienced these types of moments throughout her career, where her competence was questioned, her worth disregarded, or her passion misinterpreted. It was the subtle, constant undercurrent of bias that was so exhausting. She had learned early on that in spaces like these, she would have to fight harder, speak louder, and prove herself time and time again. It was a battle she had grown accustomed to, but it didn't make it any easier. As she stepped outside into the crisp air, she paused for a moment, taking in the city around her. The courthouse loomed behind her, a symbol of justice that didn't always feel just. Maya had come a long way to get here. She was no stranger to adversity. Raised in a neighborhood where dreams often felt too far out of reach, Maya's ambition had always been the one thing that kept her moving forward. She had watched as friends and family struggled with the weight of systemic inequality, but it only fueled her desire to break free from the mold that society had tried to place on her. She earned her degree with late-night study sessions, sacrificing sleep and social life to prove she belonged in law school. The road had been long, but Maya made it. And despite everything, despite the challenges, the doubts, and the many times she had been overlooked, she had carved out a space for herself as a rising star in the legal world. Her reputation for fierce advocacy and sharp legal insight had earned her respect from her peers, even if some still doubted her because of her race or gender. The fine she had just received felt like a reminder that some battles were not over. Driving through the streets of the city, Maya replayed the moment in the courtroom over and over in her mind. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't been disrespectful, yet Judge Everly had imposed the fine with an air of finality. Her thoughts drifted to the years of training and sacrifice that had brought her to this point. She was proud of the work she had done and the cases she had won, but there were always moments like this, when her very existence in the courtroom felt like an obstacle to be overcome rather than a natural part of the process. But Maya knew she couldn't let herself get bogged down by it. She had a responsibility to her client and to the people who had helped her get here. She had learned to rise above moments like this, to channel her frustration into focus, and to remember that she wasn't alone. There were others, like her, who were also fighting to make a difference. Maya was part of a larger movement, a generation of lawyers who were pushing for a system that was truly just, where every voice could be heard, regardless of who you were or where you came from. As she pulled into her apartment complex, she sat in her car for a moment, taking a deep breath. The day was far from over. The case she was working on, the one that had brought her into that courtroom in the first place, was critical. It wasn't just about her. It was about making sure that her client's rights were upheld and that the truth was revealed, no matter the cost. Maya had a purpose, and she wouldn't let anything, not a fine, not a judge's disapproval, deter her from fulfilling it. She grabbed her briefcase and walked into her apartment, already focusing on the next step. The world didn't stop for setbacks. Neither would she. Judge Thomas Everly sat in his chambers, reviewing the case files in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the incident with Maya Johnson in the courtroom. He ran his hand over his face, trying to shake off the discomfort that lingered. He was used to people challenging his authority, but something about her presence had unsettled him. It wasn't just the challenge to his decision. It was the confidence with which she had presented herself. As a seasoned judge with years of experience, Everly prided himself on his ability to maintain control of every courtroom he presided over. But today, with Maya, it had felt different. He tried to justify the fine he had imposed on her. Her tone had been sharp, disrespectful even in his mind, but was it really the tone that bothered him, or was it the fact that she was a woman, standing her ground in a space that was often not welcoming to women, especially black women? Like her? Everly wasn't sure. He had never been one to think about race or gender too deeply. He considered himself fair, unbiased even. After all, his decisions were based on the law, on evidence, on facts. Yet, as he sat there, something about Maya's steadfastness stirred something inside of him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. His fingers hovered over the fine line of his gavel as he recalled the moment when Maya had stood up in the courtroom, her expression unwavering as she challenged him. Most people would have buckled under the weight of his authority, but not her. Her sharp, deliberate words hadn't come from a place of anger. They had come from a place of belief, a belief in the system and in her own ability to change things. That thought struck him in a way he wasn't prepared for. Why had he reacted so strongly? Was it because she, in that brief moment, had made him question his own judgment? Was it because he had, for the first time in years, felt challenged in a way that made him uncomfortable? Everly leaned back in his chair, staring out of the window of his office. The city below bustled with life, but in his mind, there was a growing realization that something was shifting beneath the surface. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep his emotions in check, to never let personal feelings interfere with his professional decisions. But what if his judgment was flawed? What if his actions, his decisions, had been influenced by biases he wasn't even aware of? He thought about his past cases, the decisions he had made over the years. He was proud of the career he had built, but a nagging doubt crept into his mind. How many times had he ruled against someone without truly seeing them for who they were? How many times had his judgment been clouded by unconscious bias, the kind that whispered in the back of his mind, but never fully revealed itself? The questions felt unsettling, yet necessary. Everly stood up, pacing the room. The law was meant to be blind, to treat everyone the same, but was it really? As a judge, he had always believed he was impartial. He had been taught that the law was clear, that it was simple. Yet in that moment with Maya, he realized that perhaps the law wasn't as simple as he had thought, and maybe he wasn't as objective as he had always believed himself to be. His reflection was interrupted by a soft knock on his door, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was time to prepare for the next day's hearings, but as Everly turned back to his desk, he knew one thing for certain. His encounter with Maya Johnson had changed something inside him. What that change would lead to, he wasn't sure, but he was certain it wouldn't be easy. The next day, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Maya could feel the weight of the case she was about to present, knowing that it was far bigger than her. Today, she wasn't just representing a client, she was standing for something larger. It wasn't just about proving a case, it was about ensuring that justice could be truly equitable for everyone, no matter who they were. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the tension of an impending showdown. Maya took her seat, glancing around the familiar faces, some of whom had witnessed the tension between her and Judge Everly the day before. As the judge entered the courtroom, there was a moment of silence, and everyone rose to their feet. Everly entered with his usual composed stride, his black robe flowing behind him as he settled into his seat behind the bench. His eyes briefly flickered over to Maya, and for a moment, their gazes locked. There was something unspoken between them, a silent acknowledgement of the complexity of the situation. But he quickly turned his attention back to the case at hand. Today, Maya's case wasn't just any ordinary civil case. It was one that would examine the very integrity of the judicial system, a system that Everly had long upheld with the belief that it was above reproach. The case was about misconduct, specifically allegations of bias and racial discrimination in the courtroom. Judge Everly himself was under investigation for his past rulings, and Maya, as part of a legal oversight committee, was tasked with leading the case against him. As the proceedings began, Maya stood tall, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. She wasn't intimidated by the presence of Judge Everly on the bench, even though he had been the one to fine her just the day before. There was a calm confidence in her tone as she presented the evidence, each piece carefully laid out to build her case. She could feel the weight of the eyes in the room, the quiet murmurs of disbelief, but she focused entirely on the task at hand. She wasn't here for retribution. She was here because the truth needed to be heard. As Maya presented her first piece of evidence, the courtroom fell silent. The documents she showed were damning, detailing a history of rulings that had disproportionately affected minority defendants. Maya didn't mince words. She laid out the patterns of bias that had become evident in Everly's rulings over the years. The evidence painted a clear picture of a judge whose decisions, whether intentional or not, had been influenced by unconscious biases. Judge Everly's expression didn't change as Maya spoke. He sat stone-faced behind the bench, but something in his eyes flickered, a flash of recognition, perhaps, or a subtle unease. He had never considered that his decisions, which he believed were rooted in strict legal precedent, might have been affected by something more insidious. The weight of the case, the fact that he was sitting as the defendant in his own courtroom, was starting to settle on him. His gaze kept returning to Maya as she spoke, and though he would never admit it aloud, he felt the shift in power. She was no longer the attorney he had dismissed yesterday. She was the one in charge now. Maya continued, presenting more evidence that outlined the systemic nature of the problem. She spoke with a level of clarity and precision that left little room for doubt. The more she spoke, the more she could feel the shift in the room. The jury, who had been initially hesitant, now seemed to lean in, paying closer attention. Even the courtroom staff, who had seen countless trials, seemed riveted by the unfolding drama. Maya wasn't just making a case for her client anymore. She was making a case for fairness, for accountability, for change. As the session drew to a close, Maya returned to her seat, but not before briefly glancing up at the judge. Everly caught her gaze once more, this time with a look that could only be described as thoughtful. The storm was building within him. His belief in his own infallibility was beginning to crack, and though he was not ready to admit it, he knew he was no longer the unquestioned authority in the room. The next day, the atmosphere in the courtroom was charged with an electric tension that seemed to grow with each passing minute. The walls of the old courthouse, filled with years of history, now seemed to echo with the weight of this particular trial. Maya sat at the defense table, a calm figure in the storm of legal proceedings. She was well prepared. Each document, each piece of evidence, laid out meticulously before her. Today, she would continue to present her case against Judge Everly. But she could feel the shift in the air. The challenge had become more than just a fight for justice for her client. It had become something deeper, something more personal. As Maya rose to her feet, the courtroom quieted. She addressed the judge with the same measured tone she had used since the beginning. The evidence she had presented the day before had already cast doubt on Everly's fairness, but Maya knew the real turning point was yet to come. She needed to ensure that the story she was telling wasn't just about facts, but about the deeper implications of those facts. Her words would need to pierce the heart of the matter. Was the justice system truly just, or was it as flawed and biased as the man sitting behind the bench? Maya started by referencing the case law, the precedent that had been set by other judges facing similar allegations. She meticulously explained how Everly's rulings mirrored patterns of discrimination seen in the past, pointing out the subtle ways in which bias could seep into decisions, often unnoticed. She wasn't attacking Everly as a person, but she was attacking the system that had allowed these biases to thrive unchecked. She spoke passionately, her words weaving a narrative of inequality and the desperate need for change. Judge Everly's eyes never left her as she spoke. His posture, usually so confident and commanding, was slightly slouched now. He was listening, yes, but there was an unmistakable look of discomfort in his expression. As Maya spoke of the disproportionate sentences handed down to minority defendants, of the subtle ways in which he had ruled based on preconceived notions rather than facts, the weight of her words seemed to press upon him. His face, which had once been a mask of authority, now betrayed signs of uncertainty. For the first time in his career, Everly was forced to reckon with the idea that he might not have been the impartial figure he had always believed himself to be. The room seemed to hold its breath. There was a palpable tension, and even those who had once doubted Maya's ability to make a strong case began to sit forward in their seats. Maya's voice remained steady, each word carefully chosen, yet filled with the undeniable passion of someone who had fought for years to be seen and heard. She wasn't just making a legal argument, she was fighting for the integrity of the entire system. As she finished her argument and took her seat, the silence in the room was deafening. The judge had yet to speak, but it was clear that Maya had shaken him. He cleared his throat, his hands resting on the edge of the bench. His gaze moved over the documents in front of him, his eyes skimming the evidence she had presented once more. The room was waiting for him to respond, but Everly seemed lost in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice measured but laced with a tone that Maya had never heard from him before, a tone that seemed almost uncertain. "Ms. Johnson," he began slowly, his words deliberate, "I must admit, the facts you've presented have caused me to reconsider many things about my rulings." His voice faltered for just a moment, a rare slip in a judge who had spent decades perfecting the art of maintaining control. "I have always believed that my decisions were based on the law. But now," he trailed off, his eyes shifting away from Maya for a brief second, as if searching for the right words. Maya watched him closely, her expression unreadable. The moment was not lost on her. She knew this was the turning point. The judge was not just reconsidering the case. He was confronting a much deeper question, the question of whether the law he had sworn to uphold had ever truly been fair to everyone. The tension in the room grew as Everly continued, I need more time to process this." He turned toward the court clerk. "We'll recess for the day." Maya sat back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when the system itself had to confront the biases that had been allowed to persist for too long. But even as she realized the significance of this moment, she knew the real work had just begun. She wasn't just fighting for her client anymore. She was fighting for the future of justice itself. The recess was brief, but it felt like an eternity to everyone in the courtroom. Maya sat in her chair, her fingers gripping the edges of the table as her mind raced. The moment Judge Everly had just revealed himself to be uncertain, It was unexpected, but Maya had known it was coming. She had seen the cracks in the system before, but this was different. This was a judge, a man who had made countless decisions from his perch of authority, now standing face to face with the possibility that those decisions might not have been fair. The weight of the realization was heavy, and Maya knew it wouldn't be easy for him to come to terms with it. As the recess concluded, the courtroom slowly began to fill again. The sound of murmurs was drowned out by the gavel, the sharp noise signaling the return of order to the space. Judge Everly sat behind the bench once more, his expression more solemn than usual. He glanced down at the case file, his eyes scanning the documents before lifting his gaze to meet Maya's. There was a brief pause, a moment of silent recognition between them. "Maya," the judge began, his voice steady but softer than it had been before. "I've taken some time to reconsider what's been presented, and I admit, I've made mistakes." The words were slow, measured, but they carried the weight of something deeper. "I have always believed my decisions were based on a strict interpretation of the law, but I see now that the lens through which I view those laws may have been clouded by my own biases." Maya felt a rush of emotions, relief, but also caution. She had been through too much to take comfort in a single apology. She had seen others apologize before, only to repeat their mistakes later. But there was something in the judge's eyes now, something raw and vulnerable, that suggested this wasn't just a moment of politeness. He was grappling with something much bigger than either of them. Judge Everly continued, his voice carrying across the room. "I've seen the evidence, and I can no longer deny that my rulings have had a disproportionate impact on minority defendants. I have failed to hold myself to the standard of fairness that I promised when I took this position." His words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, the room was utterly silent. "I need to make this right, but I'm not sure how to begin." Maya nodded, her gaze unwavering. She had expected some kind of admission, but hearing it out loud from the very man who had imposed that fine on her, the man who had once seemed so unshakable, it was powerful. "Judge Everly," she began, her voice calm and even, "recognizing that change is needed is the first step. But it's not enough to just acknowledge the problem. We have to make sure the system is corrected, not just for the people who stand before you, but for the generations that will follow." She paused, letting her words sink in. There are many ways to address this. It's not just about changing rulings or addressing one case. It's about creating a system that works for everyone, regardless of their background or the color of their skin. Maya's voice grew stronger as she spoke, the passion that had driven her to law school and into the courtroom evident in every word. "We need to ensure that bias is eradicated from the system, that people of all races, genders, and identities can walk into any courtroom and feel they will be judged fairly." Judge Everly leaned forward, his hands clasped together. His gaze never left Maya as she spoke. "And how would you suggest we do that?" he asked, his voice quiet, but genuine. Maya took a deep breath, her mind moving quickly. "We need more training for judges and law enforcement. We need systems in place to monitor decisions to ensure they are free from racial or gender biases. We need oversight and transparency in the courtroom so that accountability is not just a word, but a reality." Judge Everly nodded slowly. "And you believe this can change things?" "I believe it has to," Maya said, her eyes locking with his. "It's the only way to ensure justice is truly for all." The judge sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of his desk. It was clear that Maya's words had left an impact, stirring something inside him that would take more than just a moment to process. But Maya could see the determination in his eyes. This wasn't the same judge who had imposed a fine on her days ago. He was someone who had taken the first step toward real change, and though it was uncertain what the future held, Maya knew they were on the right path. She had planted the seed. Now it was up to the system to decide how it would grow. The days that followed the courtroom exchange between Maya and Judge Everly were filled with a tense anticipation. The case was far from over, and though the judge had taken a step toward acknowledging the flaws in the system, Maya knew there was still much work to be done. Her heart ached with the knowledge that the road to real change was long and uncertain, but for the first time in her career, she felt as though she was part of something much bigger than herself. Judge Everly requested an unprecedented meeting with her outside of court, a move that surprised Maya. The invitation came through an assistant, and she couldn't help but wonder what his next steps would be. Was he truly committed to change, or was he merely looking for a way to salvage his reputation? Maya, always a realist, had learned not to trust words alone. Action was what mattered, and she was determined to hold him accountable for his actions, whatever his motivations. When Maya walked into Everly's private chambers, she was greeted by the judge's assistant, who led her to a seat across from the judge's desk. The atmosphere was noticeably different from the courtroom. It was quieter here, less formal, almost vulnerable. Judge Everly stood up when she entered, a slight but genuine nod of acknowledgement. "Maya," he said, his voice steady, but there was a trace of something more human, beneath the usual authority in his tone. "Thank you for coming." "Of course," Maya replied, not taking her seat just yet. "You said you wanted to discuss something." Judge Everly motioned for her to sit, and she did so cautiously, unsure of what to expect. The silence between them was thick, filled with the weight of everything that had transpired in the last few days. The judge began to speak, his words measured. "After everything that's happened, I've realized that this isn't just about me. It's about the system, the very structure of the law, and its inherent flaws." He paused, his fingers tapping on the desk. "I've spent my career convinced that I was fair, impartial, and blind to bias. But I see now that this system, as it stands, is far from perfect. I've made rulings that, in hindsight, reflect a system that's deeply flawed." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I want to change that. I need to." Maya listened carefully. His words were strong, but they weren't enough. Not yet. She had heard similar promises before, from people who had ultimately remained too comfortable with the status quo. "What exactly are you proposing, Judge?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Everly leaned forward, his tone resolute. "I want to work with you. I want to help create a program that addresses judicial bias and provides real oversight. I want to take responsibility for what's happened in this courtroom, and for the harm that my rulings have caused. I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to do more than apologize. I need to make tangible changes." Maya studied him for a moment, weighing his words. This wasn't what she had expected. There was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to downplay his role in the systemic issues. Instead, there was a genuine desire to act. But Maya knew the true measure of his commitment would come through action, not words. "If we're going to make real change," she said, her voice steady, "we need more than just promises. We need accountability. A structured plan, oversight, and a commitment to long-term action." Everly nodded. "I agree. That's why I want to involve others. Lawyers, advocates, scholars, people who have been directly affected by these biases. I want us to build something together, something that can change the way this courthouse operates. This will be a long process, but I'm ready for it." Maya looked at him for a long moment, her mind racing. There was still so much to be done. But for the first time, she could see the potential for real reform. It wasn't just a case anymore, it was a movement, and she was at the heart of it. "I'll help you," Maya said finally, her voice unwavering. "But I won't do it alone. We need a coalition, people who have been directly impacted by the system's failures. This isn't something one person can fix. It's bigger than that." Judge Everly's eyes softened, and he nodded in agreement. "I understand, and I'm ready to do the work, whatever it takes." As Maya stood to leave, she realized that this moment marked a turning point, not just for Judge Everly, but for the justice system itself. The journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, Maya believed that real change was possible. The weeks that followed the meeting between Maya and Judge Everly were a whirlwind of action and strategy. What had started as a courtroom battle against a biased judicial system had now evolved into something bigger, a shared mission to overhaul the very foundation of justice. Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose as she dove into her work, but she knew it was not just her fight anymore. The responsibility had shifted. Now, it was about ensuring the momentum didn't fizzle out, about ensuring that the steps they were taking would lead to lasting change. Maya and Everly worked together in a way no one had ever anticipated. Their partnership was an unlikely one, but it was one grounded in an honest recognition of the flaws that plagued the system. The judge, with his years of experience and knowledge of courtrooms, provided insight into the mechanics of judicial decisions, while Maya brought her passion, her perspective as a lawyer who had fought tirelessly for equality, and her dedication to reform. They began by creating a task force, a diverse group of legal professionals, scholars, and activists who were not afraid to speak the truth about the injustices they had witnessed. Maya led the effort to ensure that every voice, especially those of marginalized communities, was heard. She worked tirelessly, collaborating with advocacy groups, civil rights organizations, and legal experts who had spent their careers trying to shine a light on the very issues they were now tackling. Judge Everly, though still a figure of authority in the courtroom, had taken a backseat in many of the discussions. He understood that true change would come from listening, not from dictating. It was difficult for him to let go of his role as the person with all the answers, but he trusted Maya and the team they had assembled. Together, they put forward a plan, a blueprint for a more equitable judicial system. The first step was the creation of a comprehensive bias training program for all judges, one that would address both conscious and unconscious bias. Maya insisted that the training be rigorous and ongoing, ensuring that it wasn't just a one-time seminar, but a lifelong process of self-reflection and growth. The program would also include mechanisms for accountability, including regular audits of judicial decisions to assess whether any racial, gender, or socioeconomic patterns emerged that could indicate systemic bias. In addition to the training, they proposed the establishment of an independent oversight board made up of people from all walks of life, community leaders, social workers, and legal experts, whose job would be to monitor the implementation of these reforms. The board would have the power to investigate complaints, review cases, and make recommendations for further change. It was a bold proposal, but it was necessary to ensure that the reforms would be more than just symbolic. The process wasn't without its challenges. There were those who resisted, including some within the very system that had allowed the biases to persist. But Maya and Everly pressed on, their determination unwavering. They knew that the resistance they faced was a reflection of the deep-rooted problems they were trying to address. Change was never easy, especially when it meant confronting decades of entrenched injustice. And then, one day, as Maya sat in a meeting with the oversight board, she received a call. It was from Judge Everly. "Maya," he said, his voice filled with an emotion she had never heard from him before, "I wanted to tell you something. The board has approved the first stage of the reforms. It's happening." Maya's heart skipped a beat. After everything they had worked for, after the long hours, the difficult conversations, and the battles fought, it was finally happening. The work wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this was a monumental step. They were going to change the system together. As Maya hung up the phone, she took a moment to breathe. The fight had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But for the first time, she could see the possibility of a future where justice was truly for all. She had fought against a biased system, but now she was helping build something that could one day be better. A system that could be trusted to protect everyone, no matter who they were. In that moment, Maya realized something profound. She wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was a catalyst for change. And though the journey had been fraught with challenges, she knew the victory they had just won was one that would ripple through generations. Justice, at last, had begun to change.